Our speciality is about integrating solar into the built environment. We are a manufacturer of PV and a manufacturer of solar building products. We're a UK company, but we operate across Europe, especially in France and Italy. And just to sort of link into the previous presentation, big believer in offshore wind myself personally, and I see that solar plays very much a complementary part in the overall mix of renewables, and in particular, not just the mix of renewable technologies, but the mix between central and distributed generation. The purpose of my talk this afternoon is to give a briefing on the UK solar industry, and what I want to do is talk about the scale of the industry and its shape, how PV costs are falling, the UK solar feed-in tariff and the recent review, and then to finish up with some examples. I'll give you a briefing on the solar industry with a UK focus. So without further ado, some facts about the solar industry. 40 gigawatts total installed capacity worldwide. And just to put that into perspective, that's about half the electricity consumption of Greece. And 15 gigawatts was installed in 2010. So if you do the sums, that's about 55% growth in 2010. That was a little bit high. The industry has averaged 40% compound for the last 12 years. And that also means there's about a doubling of installed capacity every 2 years. I joined the industry in 2006, and during that time, costs have dropped by 2/3. And again, just to put some figures around this, the European Strategic Energy Technology Plan is that 12% of Europe's electricity should come from PV. That's not including the other solar technologies by 2020, and that you can read at the bottom, 20% of global electricity by PV by 2050. And just to also touch on a comment by the previous speaker, solar PV works on light, not heat, so it's entirely about the light irradiance, and that the largest global installed base and the largest market for solar PV is Germany, which has roughly the same irradiance as certainly southern UK and Wales. I was asked by the organisers to speak a bit about the value chain, and here are two value chains in the solar business. I'll focus firstly on the top one, which is about crystalline silicon. So you start off on the on your left-hand side with sand that's turned into silicon, made into ingots about the size of a small loaf of bread, sliced up into wafers, turned into cells, strung together and glued onto glass to make modules. And then you have something we call the balance of systems. That's all to do with the inverters, the cabling, and the mounting systems. The process of installing that into usable solar installations, and then finally operations and maintenance to look after it. You can get a sense as to how the value chain divides by number of companies, and there is every possible combination of companies playing around with being in each different part of that value chain. And certainly we at SolarCentury have found that the art of making money is about very carefully selecting the right part of that value chain to be in. And you can see a couple of journeys that one taken by some Chinese module companies and one taken by ourselves. We started off very much as a project systems integrator, and we have moved into becoming a manufacturer. Down the bottom is thin films. Thin films are the same, but where you're in effect putting the photovoltaic element directly onto a piece of glass. That mops up all that part of the value chain, and then the rest is very similar. Thin film is growing faster than crystalline silicon, but my personal view is that crystalline silicon will still be the dominant technology in 2020 in terms of solar photovoltaics. And the industry is growing like crazy, and consolidation has been about to happen ever since I joined it in 2006. To move on and speak a little bit about solar costs, I think this applies to all renewables, where most people think, yep, solar PV, wind or whatever is great if only it were cheaper. And I've got a couple of slides just to explain what's happening in terms of bringing the costs down of solar PV. The first one is this. This is this little graph of straight and wiggly lines represents about 30 years of experience. And what it shows is that the cost has been falling by about a quarter every time the number of installs double, and that's held true during that 30-year period. To pick up on a comment of the last speaker, the increased amount of wobbliness of those blue and purple lines I put down entirely to supply chain immaturity. For us, the whole existence in the PV business is about there either being an oversupply and prices crashing, or an undersupply and we're having trouble getting hold of the stuff. And there is never a happy Goldilocks medium between the two. The 40 gigawatts are where those lines roll out at the end of that particular chart. I think a perfectly reasonable challenge to the industry would be to say, hang on a minute, this crystalline solar stuff has been around since 1954. It's mature. How can you keep reducing costs like that? And I'll pick just one example of what is happening and why we might like to think that these costs will continue to fall. So this particular slide shows two parameters. The orange bars are the thickness of the wafers that are sliced out of that small loaf I described at the beginning. And most of the cost of a PV module is around the silicon and the energy required to make that silicon. And what the industry is doing is figuring out how to do that with ever thinner slices. So from the same ingot, the same loaf of bread, you get more slices. And you can see the shape of the curve. These are industry projections through to 2020. And we're currently running at about 180 microns, and the forecast is to get down to 90. Even at 180 microns, if you sneeze, you turn a wafer into dust. Just to give you a sense of but it's simple physical stuff as to how the costs will keep coming down. The yellow line there is about the grams of silicon per watt. And you'll notice that that's actually falling slightly steeper than the thickness of the wafers. And that's because as well as getting the wafers thinner, they're also getting slightly more efficient. But you can also deduce from these two graphs that the dominant factor is about making thinner wafers, not making more efficient silicon. A lot of people say solar PV is going to be much better and much cheaper when it's more efficient, and that's simply not going to be the case. So the big cost down and all the stuff around cost down that I've just described about the silicon and the wafers is coming from big, the small number of large suppliers of the silicon and the machinery for slicing it up into wafers. There is, however, a secondary effect. And the secondary effect is that as the costs of PV are coming down and down and down, so the cost of everything else as a relative proportion of the install is going up. So the electrical and mounting mechanical systems and the installation are becoming ever more part of the cost of a PV system. And this is some of our own analysis that was done back in 2008. My personal view is it's actually out of date, and this understates the case, and we need to be updating this. And the innovation is taking place in all these areas to try and bring costs down. And just one little example that I love, nothing to do with our business, is that once you start doing lots of small installs, things like putting scaffolding up becomes a dominant cost of a PV system. We think that reducing cost is all about high-tech, more advanced molecules and better silicon. There's a company that's produced a system called EasyDeck that's basically a scaffolding system that you can prop up against the wall of a house and tie it down with guy ropes. That has quite a significant impact in the overall cost of the install of a PV system. So there's lots of local innovation that needs to take place. And that's important for the UK. Just to leave you with a number, for every one production job of PV, there are 4 installation jobs. and believe me, they are higher margin jobs than in producing PV modules. To move on to my next piece, a few words about the feed-in tariff. All of this cost down and growth of the industry, as many of the speakers have said over the last 2 days, can only happen with the stability of a regulatory and an incentive regime. And it's all about the cumulative effect of experience that allows us to invest in order to bring the costs down, as we all need to do. And the stability of that support is absolutely critical in terms of whether a company chooses to invest in plant or training or whatever it might be. And just to give you the UK feed-in tariffs, the ones on your left are the ones that apply up until midnight on the 31st of July, and the ones on the right post the 1st of August. You don't need to really worry too much about the particular numbers, but I just draw your attention to what is happening on the right-hand side for the 50 to 150 kilowatt size of installation. And you'll see that the tariff has almost halved, and as you get to bigger systems, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that that's a message that is very loud and clear from the government, that what they're looking to do is to incentivize more smaller systems. The tariffs are extremely attractive still for sub 50 kilowatts. And less so for the larger projects. And I think that there are a number of reasons behind this. Not least that one thing that PV does very well is work as a distributed energy system. And what's being incentivized here is for PV to be used not just as a renewable zero carbon energy system, but also a distributed energy system. And that's the message this change of tariff says. Yes, certainly. Quickly say, there are a number of installations that happened in the first year in the UK. You can see the numbers. It was dominated by PV. It's not because PV is necessarily a better technology, but it is very quick to deploy and start to roll out. Virtually all of those installs were small systems. And I'm going to finish up by bringing the PV installations to life. So this is what 77 kilowatts looks like on a builder's merchants in France. Our view is that the cut-off at 50 kilowatts is a bit too small, because it means that a project even of this scale wouldn't be taking place anymore. You would cover just half the roof instead of all the roof. This is a photograph of what most UK solar farms look like in the beginning of June. They've been using the period of the feed-in tariff to go through the planning and permitting process, and everybody will be scrambling to get these connected before midnight on the 31st of July. And believe me, there will be some connected late on the 31st of July. This is 5 megawatts just up the road from here in Wilburton. But certainly for the near future in the UK, we're going to see a lot more of this, where you have social landlords putting 2 kilowatts on 1,000 houses instead of 2 megawatts in one field. And then to finish up, that this is what a new build home looks like with 16 kilowatts of PV on there. And a couple of comments. Firstly, when you start doing new build using PV, the marginal cost of installation for this was 0, because somebody would have been putting the roof on there anyway. And secondly, renewables can look great. Other governments have chosen to incentivize PV that looks great, and I would certainly urge our government to consider doing the same. So all feed-in tariffs must fade away as the costs come down, and a good feed-in tariff is one where the government turns those dials to allow that incentive to fade away in an orderly fashion. And as my parting comment, I would urge you to take a look at a report by Ernst & Young that was released a couple of days ago that talks about grid parity for commercial PV, happening here in the UK around 2017. And if you look at a straight residential grid parity, where you're comparing retail electricity price with the retail cost of installing on one house, it will come a lot sooner than that. So that's my briefing. Thank you very much.